He was the king who changed the very soul of England, not with swords, but with weddings. A man of towering ambition and unrelenting desire, Henry VIII didn't just rule his kingdom. He rewrote its moral code to suit his own passions. 6 wives, 2 beheaded, 2 discarded, 1 dead, only 1 survived. We know the rhyme, but what if we told you the real stories behind those queens are far darker, more shocking, and more human than any rhyme could capture? These weren't just royal marriages, they were battlegrounds of power, politics, and survival. Women became pawns, love turned to treason, and England's throne became a dangerous place to stand beside. What drove Henry to such extremes? And who were the women who risked everything to wear his crown? This is 10 shocking facts about the marriages of Henry VIII and the truths they never taught you in school. If you're fascinated by the hidden side of history, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below. Tell us which wife you believe paid the highest price. Fact 1. His first wife was actually his sister-in-law. It all began with a marriage not to Henry, but to his brother. Katherine of Aragon was just 15 years old when she arrived in England, a Spanish princess destined to become queen. But instead of Henry, she first married Prince Arthur, the eldest son of Henry VII and heir to the English throne. Their wedding was grand, their union politically strategic. But 5 months later, Arthur was dead. Now here's where things get uncomfortable. Arthur and Catherine's marriage was never supposed to matter after his death. But when Henry, only 11 at the time, eventually took the throne, he married his brother's widow. And to do that, they needed special permission from the Pope. Because, according to the book of Leviticus, marrying your brother's wife is an abomination, a sin, unless the first marriage was never consummated. And Katherine? She swore it wasn't. She insisted she and Arthur had never had sex, that their marriage was in name only. She stuck to this story for the rest of her life, even as it came to define the end of hers. Henry married her based on that claim. For 2 decades they seemed content. She was Queen of England, his loyal wife, and beloved by the people. But when she failed to produce a male heir after years of trying, Henry began to question everything. Suddenly, that old Bible passage became dangerously relevant again. If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. They shall be childless. Henry believed God was punishing him, that his marriage was cursed, and so, in a cruel twist of irony, the very thing that had once allowed their marriage, the claim that she was a virgin, was now being used to destroy it. Henry spent 6 agonizing years demanding an annulment. Katherine refused to go quietly. She maintained her virtue. She called herself the true queen to her dying breath. And when the Pope sided with her, Henry broke with the Catholic Church forever. Think about that. England's break with Rome, the English Reformation, the rise of Protestantism, didn't begin with theology. It began with a marriage, with a king's obsession, and with a woman who refused to lie down and disappear. In the end, Katherine was cast aside, banished from court, forbidden from seeing her daughter Mary. She died alone in a damp castle, still calling herself Queen of England. And what of the boy who once married his brother's widow? He was already falling in love with another woman, a woman named Anne Boleyn. But what if Anne wasn't the seductress we think she was? Stay with us, because fact number 2 will change everything you thought you knew about Anne Boleyn and Henry's most scandalous affair. Fact 2. No intimacy before Crown Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn. Her name is synonymous with seduction, the woman who bewitched a king, they said, a temptress who tore apart a marriage, split a kingdom, and lured Henry VIII into madness. But what if the truth is far more surprising? What if Anne Boleyn wasn't the seductress, but the one holding the line? Let's rewind to the early 1520s. Anne wasn't yet queen. She wasn't even the king's mistress. She was a lady-in-waiting to Queen Katherine, just another elegant figure in the tapestry of court life. Beautiful? Certainly, charismatic, undeniably. But Anne had a secret weapon. She knew how to say no. While her sister, Mary Boleyn, had already warmed the king's bed and faded into the background, Anne refused to be just another conquest. She denied him her body. For 6 years. That's longer than most royal marriages lasted in Tudor England. Henry was used to getting what he wanted. Women, land, loyalty, all came easily to the King of England. But Anne was different. She knew how power worked. She saw what happened to women like her sister, and she made a dangerous wager. If she was ever going to be with Henry, it would be as queen, or not at all. And so began the most obsessive, prolonged, and politically explosive courtship in English history. Henry wrote her 17 surviving love letters, unusual for a monarch. In them, he pours out passion, frustration, adoration. He calls her my mistress and my friend, swears he'll serve only you. And yet, no evidence suggests they were physically intimate before marriage. Even the Pope's court, in all its investigations, found no proof they had been lovers. Anne's refusal to consummate the relationship gave her leverage, and it gave Henry madness. It wasn't just desire anymore. It was obsession. He had to make her queen. But to do that, he had to get rid of Katherine, which meant splitting from Rome, breaking the laws of the church, and triggering a religious revolution, all for a woman he had never touched. And when he finally married Anne in secret in January 1533, the tension was unbearable. All of England was watching. She was pregnant. If the child was a son, it would validate everything. It wasn't. It was Elizabeth. Henry's dream turned to dust. Anne had denied him for years to protect herself, to become queen, but the very act of becoming queen removed the protection. Now she had to produce a son. Nothing else mattered. The rejection that once enchanted Henry now enraged him. And Anne, once untouchable, had become disposable. He had waited years to touch her. But once he did, he found another. And that brings us to Jane Seymour, Anne's lady-in-waiting. The woman who replaced her almost overnight. Stay with us. The speed of Anne's downfall and Jane's rise will leave you speechless. Fact 3. Jane Seymour was Anne Boleyn's lady-in-waiting. It's a chilling image, one woman rising while another is condemned to fall. But in Tudor England, that wasn't metaphor. That was survival. Anne Boleyn had been queen for just under 3 years when another quiet figure entered Henry's orbit. Her name, Jane Seymour. Modest, pale, gentle, everything Anne was not. And here's what history tends to overlook. Jane Seymour was Anne Boleyn's lady-in-waiting. That's right. The woman who would one day take her place was standing behind her in silk and silence, learning her moods, studying her flaws, and waiting. Jane came from a noble but politically cautious family. No one expected her to rise beyond the background. She wasn't fiery or seductive like Anne. She didn't argue politics. She didn't dazzle a room, but she knew how to play the long game. And Henry? He was already growing cold toward Anne. She had failed to give him the one thing he wanted most, a male heir. Her pregnancies had ended in miscarriage. Her temper had made enemies. Her sparkle was beginning to dim. Then came the whispers. A new lady, a new face, a woman who curtsied deeper, spoke softer, and one day slipped the king a note. Henry was entranced. Unlike Anne, Jane didn't fight. She didn't challenge him. She played the perfect opposite. And Henry, perhaps tired of the storm Anne brought, longed for peace. Here's the truly disturbing part. While Anne was still queen, still fighting for her crown, Henry was already courting Jane. He sent her gifts, jewels, things Anne had once treasured. He visited her in secret. His courtship was calculated. Anne knew, and she was terrified. By spring of 1536, Anne's enemies had gathered strength. Thomas Cromwell, once her ally, turned on her. A plot was born. Charges of adultery, incest, treason. Fabricated or not, it worked. Anne was arrested in May. Within days she stood trial. The jury was packed with men whose lives and titles depended on her fall. She was found guilty, sentenced to die. But Henry, he was already planning his next wedding. On May 19th, 1536, Anne Boleyn was beheaded by a French swordsman on Tower Green. On May 20th, just one day later, Henry became engaged to Jane Seymour. One day. No mourning, no hesitation, only ambition. And 11 days later, they were married. No time was wasted, no curtain drawn. Anne was gone. Jane was queen. From lady-in-waiting to Queen of England in less than 2 weeks. Not by love, but by cold succession. Jane had watched Anne fall from inches away. She learned everything, what to say, what not to say, how to win without fighting. And for a brief moment it worked. But Jane's story ends in a way none of the others did, by finally giving Henry what he wanted, and paying the ultimate price. Stay with us, because the next fact will rewrite everything you thought you knew about Henry's so-called ugly marriage. Fact 4. Anne of Cleves wasn't ugly. Henry lied. She was the wife Henry VIII never wanted to touch, and the one who outlived them all. Anne of Cleves. History has not been kind to her. In schoolbooks and documentaries, she's often reduced to a punchline. The Flanders mare. An insult whispered through centuries. But who gave her that name? And was it even true? The story begins with politics, not passion. By 1539, Henry was widowed. Jane Seymour, his true love, had died in childbirth. But Europe was growing dangerous. The Pope wanted England back under Catholic control, and France and the Holy Roman Empire were considering alliance. Henry needed a new wife and a powerful ally. Enter Anne of Cleves. She came from the Protestant Duchy of Cleves, strategic, respectable, and importantly not Catholic. But Henry hadn't met her, so he did what kings of the day did. He sent a painter, not just any painter, Hans Holbein, a genius of portraiture. When the portrait returned, Henry was delighted. Anne looked regal, composed, exactly what a queen should be. But then she arrived. Henry disguised himself in true romantic fashion, thinking he'd surprise her and spark instant chemistry. It backfired. Anne didn't recognize him, nor did she bow or blush. She barely reacted. Henry, already self-conscious about his age, weight, and leg ulcers, was humiliated. From that moment on, he declared he'd been tricked, that she was nothing like the portrait, that she was, his words, nothing fair. He began calling her the Flanders mare, implying she looked like a large horse. But here's the twist. There's no evidence anyone else found Anne unattractive. Courtiers described her as modest, tall, with fair skin and blonde hair. Her portrait was accurate. Even ambassadors were baffled by Henry's disgust. Modern historians now believe the problem wasn't Anne, it was Henry. He had grown paranoid, insecure, impotent. His ego couldn't tolerate rejection or disappointment. He may have been physically incapable of consummating the marriage, and rather than face that truth, he blamed her appearance. The marriage was awkward, cold, and, critically, never consummated. After just 6 months, Henry sought an annulment. And here's where Anne did something no other wife had dared. She agreed. She admitted the marriage hadn't been fulfilled. She never called herself queen again. And in return, Henry gave her houses, jewels, a generous pension, and the honorary title of the king's beloved sister. Anne stayed in England for the rest of her life. She never remarried. She outlived Henry, all 5 of his other wives, and even Henry's beloved son Edward. She had no crown, but she had peace. They called her ugly, but she walked away with her head high, her fortune secure, and her dignity intact. And perhaps of all Henry's wives, she won. Next, we turn to the most tragic figure of them all, a teenage girl caught in a deadly game she could never win. Katherine Howard, the queen who was just a child. Fact 5. Katherine Howard, executed at 17. She was young. She was beautiful. and she had no idea she was dancing in a minefield. Katherine Howard, Henry VIII's fifth wife, has often been cast as frivolous, even promiscuous, but peel back the layers and you don't find a scheming seductress. You find a child. Historians estimate she was born around 1523. She married Henry in 1540. That would make her just 17 years old on her wedding day, barely more than a girl. And Henry? He was 49, twice widowed, obese, plagued by infected ulcers, and deeply paranoid. He could barely walk. And yet, he called her his rose without a thorn. At first, court life glittered. Katherine brought youth and vitality to a stale, nervous court. Henry showered her with jewels. She danced, smiled, and seemed to breathe life into a king who was quickly running out of it. But underneath the silk and songs, danger lurked. Katherine had secrets. Before marrying Henry, she had lived under the lax guardianship of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. That household was no place for a young girl. There was little supervision, little safety, and Katherine, perhaps lonely, perhaps flattered, had entered into inappropriate relationships. One of these was with Francis Derham, a man who likely saw Katherine's vulnerability. Another was with Henry Manox, her music teacher. Whether these were consensual or manipulative remains murky, but what's certain is this: Katherine had a past, and in Henry's world that was treason. Still, had she left her past behind, she might have survived. But after marrying the king, Katherine allegedly began meeting in secret with Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's chamber, young, dashing, and close to her age. Why? Loneliness? Desperation? A fleeting sense of youth amid the prison of queenship? We'll never know for certain, but someone found out. A bitter rival tipped off Archbishop Cranmer. An investigation began, and the evidence, real or fabricated, piled up. Love letters, confessions, eyewitness accounts. And just like that, the king's rose turned to poison. Henry was devastated. He locked himself away. He wept. And then he signed her death warrant. Katherine Howard was executed on February 13th, 1542. If she was born in 1523, she was just 19 years old. Her final words, according to legend, were, "I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Culpeper." A haunting echo of a life she was never allowed to live. She wasn't a traitor. She wasn't a schemer. She was a girl, pulled into a game she couldn't win, married to a king she could never understand. And what happened next? The survivor, the nurse, the queen who read philosophy and loved another man, the only wife who would bury Henry, not the other way around. Up next, Katherine Parr, the woman who outlived the monster, but not her own story. Fact 6. She married Henry, but loved another man. Most people remember her as the one who survived. But survival in Tudor England came at a price. Katherine Parr was Henry VIII's sixth and final wife, the one who outlived him, the one who didn't lose her head. But that doesn't mean her life was spared the heartbreak and sacrifice that marked every royal marriage before hers. Before Henry, Katherine had already been married twice, first to a young nobleman who died of illness, then to an older man, Lord Latimer, who became embroiled in rebellions against the crown. She nursed him through sickness, stood by him through political scandal, and emerged wiser, stronger, and more cautious than ever. But by the time Latimer died, Katherine was only 30, still young, still beautiful, and finally free. That's when she fell in love. Thomas Seymour, brother of Jane Seymour and uncle to Prince Edward, was charming, ambitious, and close to the royal family. Katherine and Thomas began a discreet romance. It was real. It was mutual. It was private. But then Henry noticed her. The king, now in his early 50s, bloated, sickly, and increasingly cruel, set his sights on Katherine. She didn't seek the crown. She didn't pursue him. In fact, She later confessed that she had prayed not to marry him. But what could she do? In Tudor England, when the king proposes, you say yes, or you risk everything. So she gave up her love, married Henry in 1543, and became Queen of England. But Katherine Parr was no passive consort. She was brilliant. She read Latin and Greek. She published religious books under her own name, a first for any English queen. She debated theology with bishops and even dared to discuss faith with the king himself. But her intellect made enemies. At one point, a plot was hatched to arrest her for heresy. The charges were real. Her own words were used against her. But Katherine, clever as ever, turned the tide. She fell at Henry's feet, claimed she had only ever meant to distract him from his pain with her foolish womanly prattle, and begged forgiveness. Henry believed her, or pretended to. Either way, she survived. When Henry died in 1547, Katherine was finally free again, and this time she married for love. Thomas Seymour at last. But that happy ending would not last. Katherine became pregnant for the first time in her life. She was 36, and in 1548, just days after giving birth to a daughter, she died from complications, likely of puerperal fever, the same infection that killed Jane Seymour. Thomas Seymour didn't mourn long. He turned his attention toward Princess Elizabeth, and Katherine's legacy began to fade. They say she survived Henry, but she didn't survive the world he created. Still, in her brief reign, Katherine Parr proved that a queen could be both compassionate and commanding. Next, we look back, before the queens, to the one woman Henry never married, but came closer than you might think, and the illegitimate son who almost wore the crown. Fact 7. Henry nearly married his illegitimate son's mother. Before there were 6 wives, there was one mistress. Before all the scandal, executions, and excommunications, there was a single woman who gave Henry VIII something none of his wives, at the time, could, a healthy son. Her name was Elizabeth Bessie Blount, a young noblewoman, handpicked as one of Queen Katherine of Aragon's ladies-in-waiting. But she didn't remain in the background for long. Henry was still relatively young, athletic, and full of charm. Elizabeth was graceful, witty, and clever. Their affair wasn't scandalous, at least not by Tudor standards. The Queen even turned a blind eye. What made it historic was what came next. In 1519, Elizabeth gave birth to a baby boy, a son, strong, healthy, legitimate, number. But he was alive. His name was Henry Fitzroy. Fitzroy literally meaning son of the king. For a moment, everything changed. At that point, Queen Katherine had suffered multiple stillbirths. The only surviving child was Mary, a girl. And now, here was proof that the king could father a son. The problem, Henry told himself, wasn't him. It was Katherine. Fitzroy was openly acknowledged. Given lands, titles, Duke of Richmond and Somerset, titles normally reserved for royalty. He had his own household, his own tutors, his own power. And at court, a bold idea began to stir. What if Henry made Fitzroy his heir? And what if he legitimized him? There was even talk, whispers in court shadows, that Henry might marry Elizabeth Blount. Not a queen, not foreign royalty, but the woman who had done what no queen yet had. It wasn't entirely impossible. The church allowed dispensations. Henry had married his brother's widow. Why not his mistress? But something stopped him. Perhaps it was political pressure. Perhaps it was Bessie's lower status. Or perhaps, deep down, Henry still hoped Katherine would give him a male heir, and feared the backlash of openly raising a mistress to queen. In any case, Elizabeth Blount was quietly dismissed from court. She was married off to a nobleman. Her name faded from public life. And Fitzroy? He was groomed like a prince. Some believe Henry seriously considered naming him heir. But in 1536, at just 17 years old, Henry Fitzroy died suddenly, likely of tuberculosis. The boy who might have been king, gone in an instant. And with him, the possibility of legitimizing the line through Blount vanished. Had Henry married Elizabeth Blount, history might have been rewritten. No Anne Boleyn, no break with Rome, no Reformation, no Elizabeth. England's destiny was hanging on a boy born in the shadows, and a woman the king never made his queen. Up next, we revisit Anne Boleyn's final blow, not her arrest or her trial, but a tragic miscarriage that changed everything and might have sealed her fate. Fact 8. Anne Boleyn's miscarriage was a boy. It was January 1536. The snow outside London was thick and heavy, like a blanket hiding a kingdom on edge. And inside the royal chambers, Anne Boleyn, the Queen of England, the woman Henry VIII had moved heaven and earth to marry, was pregnant again. This was it. She had already failed to produce a son. The Princess Elizabeth, bright and sharp as she was not the male heir Henry craved. A previous pregnancy had ended in miscarriage. Now, with the eyes of England watching, Anne carried the hope of her dynasty, of her survival. But fate is cruel, and Tudor fate is ruthless. Just days into the new year, disaster struck. Henry was thrown from his horse during a jousting match at Greenwich. He lay unconscious for 2 hours. Courtiers feared the worst. The news spread like wildfire. The king is dead. He wasn't. But when Anne heard, the shock was immense. She was 6 months pregnant, and the news, her husband's near-death experience, hit her with catastrophic force. Shortly after, she miscarried. A son. A perfectly formed, healthy-looking boy. Gone. According to several contemporary reports, when Henry learned what had happened, he said coldly, "I see that God will not give me male children." The room between them turned to ice. That single event, the death of a son, might have sealed Anne Boleyn's fate more than any court intrigue, any false charge, or any political enemy. Because that child wasn't just another pregnancy. He was her last chance. Henry had risked everything for Anne, his marriage, his reputation, his soul. He had broken with the Pope. He had launched the English Reformation. And for what? A daughter. And now, the loss of a son who could have justified it all. In the days that followed, Anne's enemies smelled blood. Thomas Cromwell, once her ally, turned against her. The Boleyn family lost their influence. And Henry? He began to look elsewhere. Anne's miscarriage became the symbolic breaking point, not just in her marriage, but in the very myth of Anne Boleyn. From enchantress to disappointment, from queen to traitor. Within 4 months, she was arrested, charged with adultery, incest, treason, ludicrous claims, all likely fabricated. But they stuck, because she had failed to give England a prince. Had that child lived, history might have rewritten itself. Anne might have reigned for decades. Elizabeth may never have become queen. The Reformation might have taken a different course. But the child died, and with him, Anne's fate was sealed. Up next, we uncover the only woman Henry VIII may have ever truly loved, the one he mourned, the one he chose to lie beside for eternity. Fact 9. Henry married only one true love. He married 6 women. He broke with Rome. He condemned 2 wives to death. And yet, of all these women, there may have only been one Henry VIII truly loved. Her name was Jane Seymour. Compared to the fire and fury of Anne Boleyn, Jane was quiet, gentle, even plain by court standards. But in Henry's eyes, she was everything Anne was not: submissive, devout, fertile, or so he hoped. Jane came into Henry's life like a ghost in the corridors, while Anne Boleyn was still alive, still pregnant, still fighting for her crown. Jane said little, but her silence spoke volumes. She curtsied deeper. She protested nothing. Henry was intrigued. Anne was executed on May 19th, 1536. Henry and Jane were engaged on May 20th, married 11 days later. It was fast, it was cold, but to Henry, it was a new beginning. In October 1537, Jane gave birth to the one thing Henry wanted more than power, more than love, more than peace: a son. Prince Edward, heir to the Tudor dynasty, proof that God had finally blessed him. The court erupted in celebration. Jane was hailed as a savior queen. Henry called her his only true wife, but the joy didn't last. Just 12 days after Edward's birth, Jane Seymour died, likely from puerperal fever, the same deadly infection that had claimed so many new mothers. Henry was devastated. Unlike his usual pattern, marry, move on, repeat, Henry did something different. He mourned. He wore black for months. He withdrew from court life. He never publicly celebrated again. Most telling of all, he never remarried for nearly 3 years, an eternity for a king obsessed with heirs and alliances. He commissioned no grand portraits of Jane, no elaborate funerals, just a quiet burial at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. Years later, when Henry died in 1547, he requested one thing: to be buried next to Jane, not Katherine of Aragon, his queen for 24 years, not Anne Boleyn, the woman he remade the church to marry, not the kind and wise Katherine Parr, only Jane. It wasn't the grandest love story. It wasn't the longest. But it was the only one Henry didn't try to undo. He didn't annul it. He didn't shame it. He didn't erase her. He loved her, or perhaps he loved what she gave him: a son, a legacy, a sense of divine favor. In Jane Seymour, Henry found what he had chased for decades, and in death, she alone lies beside him. But the story doesn't end there, because while Jane rests in peace, 5 other queens lie elsewhere, scattered, forgotten, alone. Our final shocking fact reveals what became of them, and why Henry's tomb is lonelier than you might think. Fact 10. 5 of his 6 wives buried without him. He was the most powerful man in England. He changed the church, the crown, and the very soul of a nation. But in the end, when the torches burned low and the prayers fell silent, Henry VIII was buried alone, not literally, but symbolically. Absolutely. Of the 6 women he married, only one, Jane Seymour, is buried with him. The other 5 queens are scattered across England, their bodies laid to rest in sorrow, secrecy, and shadows. Let's walk through the ghost map of Henry's queens. Katherine of Aragon, his first wife, the woman he cast aside after 24 years of marriage, lies buried at Peterborough Cathedral. Her grave is simple, modest. She died in isolation, banned from court, never allowed to see her daughter Mary again. To this day, visitors leave pomegranates, her symbol, at her tomb, in quiet defiance of a king who refused to share eternity with her. Anne Boleyn, once the queen for whom Henry tore down a church, lies beneath the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula inside the Tower of London. No monument marked her grave at first, just a wooden box buried quickly after her beheading. Only centuries later did a simple plaque reveal the queen who changed history and died for it. Anne of Cleves, the wife Henry never touched, rests quietly in Westminster Abbey. Ironically, she lies in the same sacred ground as queens and kings, far more beloved. She outlived all of Henry's wives and Henry himself by a full decade, and earned, in the end, a place among royalty. Katherine Howard, the teenage queen condemned for love, was buried like Anne Boleyn in the Tower. Her remains, too, lie under the stone floor of St. Peter's Chapel, near the place where she died at just 19. No grand tomb, no royal ceremony, just silence. Katherine Parr, the queen who outlived Henry but not the dangers of Tudor life, was buried at Sudeley Castle in Gloucestershire. For centuries her grave was lost, only rediscovered in the 18th century. Today she rests in peace, alone but finally honored. And Henry? He lies beneath the floor of St. George's Chapel, Windsor, under a simple marble slab beside Jane Seymour, the only wife who gave him a son. There's no towering effigy, no stained glass window in his name, just quiet stone. A king who lies in death as he lived his last years, wounded, isolated, and surrounded by absence. 6 marriages, 3 broken by death, 2 by execution. 1 survived. and only one queen shares the grave of the most infamous monarch in English history. For all his power, Henry could not control death. He ruled with iron, loved with fury. But in the end, he left behind a trail of queens who walked beside him in life, but sleep far from him in death. This was Henry VIII's story, told not just through what he built, but through what and who he broke. 6 wives, 10 shocking truths, and one legacy that still echoes through every stone of England. Subscribe for more royal secrets, untold stories, and the hidden history they never taught you.